Welcome to Get to Know Your City here on River City's Community Access Media. So happy to be with you today. My name is Milt Van Natta, and in advance of the February 16th mayoral runoff to take the three-candidate race down to two for the general election in April, we'll be bringing you a 30-minute interview with each of the candidates. Today, our mayor, Zach Vruwink, is our guest here on Get to Know Your City. Welcome to our discussion today, Mayor.
Milt, thanks for having me.
It's good to be with you. Now, Mayor, you became a prominent person in this city as a young man, first as a business owner, now as a two-term mayor. But yet, how would you tell us about yourself? There's certainly things we do not know about you, even as a public figure. Tell us about yourself.
Sure. Well, I'm a passionate young professional. I consider myself outside of my formal mayoral responsibilities and title. And, I consider myself as someone that cares deeply about this community and its future. I often think about what would it be like if I were not mayor living in the city. And that focus and frame of mind really gives me, I think, a footing that puts me in the shoes of everybody else that lives here and calls this place home, maybe calls it their work. And, as somebody that grew up here and somebody that's from the community, I love what I do. There's no questioning that. I think people see that all the time. I'm very passionate about any sort of issue or thing that's going on in the city, I certainly enjoy everything this community has to offer, whether it's being outside in the summertime. I like to run, or I like to bike. I like to take my kayak. Some people see me carrying it down from my house down to the river. All those things that I think make this place a really great place to live, and I'm happy to call it home.
As you look at this race, and as we head up to the primary, what distinguishes you from the other candidates?
Well, some would say, well, he's the incumbent. And while that's certainly true, I think the perspective that I have coming from this without having any political experience prior, but empowered with my education as well as my business experience, I feel that it really positioned me to have the aptitude and the skills necessary to take the city forward. I hear oftentimes, I heard when I first ran and I hear still today, that this city has a lot of challenges, and it certainly does. I can't say that just by electing myself as mayor that I've solved every one of them or even solved any of them by myself. And I think that's the neat part about the job is it requires building consensus and building coalitions and trying to convene groups, oftentimes to use the convening power of the office to get people together around issues that they care about or are passionate about and solving.
Okay. Talk to me about leadership in the bigger scope, because we know you've served as mayor, that you're familiar with that. Sure. But speak of yourself as a leader first in bringing your leadership skills and your leadership abilities to the mayor's office.
Well, I intend to be very inclusive, and that's to include people from all ends of the community, whether it's age you're looking at or whether it's different backgrounds, whether it's different education or jobs or unemployment maybe, that every sort of issue, whether it's through the mayor's councils that have been launched to try to bring people again around to engage people beyond sort of their participation within government, beyond the ballot box maybe, but to involve them in different parts of government. I think inclusivity is a very an element that I'm proud to have brought to the office, and feel like there's more work to be done in that regard, but that's something that I feel from a leadership quality is very important of any leader. Beyond the inclusivity component is to be very mindful of the global world in which Wisconsin Rapids is a part of. There's a lot of pressure put on Wisconsin Rapids, not by Wisconsin Rapids' own choice, right? Whether it's the national economy or the state economy. And at times I beat myself up about the fact that I wish things were better, right, for Wisconsin Rapids or for families that live here or people looking for work here. But then I'm also reminded about the national pressures, right? When I hear the governor speak or the president or anybody else for that matter, I'm reminded about the unique challenges that we think we have are really much, much bigger than us. And so I think a leader also needs to understand and recognize sort of the constraints and almost be faced with the reality. I'm a dreamer, I consider myself, and but at times I have to be faced with the reality of what is the potential, what is the opportunity for a place like Wisconsin Rapids. And sometimes realizing our potential is challenged because of the constraints of the world around us.
Given where you've taken us in this discussion, what's the most pressing issue in the city right now? What's the most pressing thing that lays on your desk?
I think economic security. I think some people will call it jobs, but it's way more than just jobs and employment.
Okay.
It's also incomes. Where are people's incomes? Are they flat? Are they declining? Or are they rising? And I think our community has been challenged since some of the economic certainty of the employment in the papermaking sector in our community has been faced with some unprecedented and accelerated decline, that people's incomes and wages have been challenged. And as survey, whether it's economic data provided by local community foundation or others, point to the fact that incomes in this community haven't climbed or haven't kept pace even with the national average. So what does that do? It leaves people facing more and more economic challenges at home, and I think that's the most pressing issue that sits on my desk. Probably the second most pressing issue that I've concerned myself with is Wisconsin Rapids' competitiveness. We often had heard that Wisconsin Rapids maybe wasn't the most friendly place to do business like it could be. We heard that, I often hear that Wisconsin Rapids maybe hasn't been as welcoming in areas, whether it's to visitors or business people or what have you. And I've taken that challenge head on, recognizing that if first we got to check the facts, right? If are we competitive or are we not? And oftentimes we find that we're not quite as out of competitiveness or out of whack than some like to think we are. And so that's a reassuring thing that I didn't know prior to serving in the role, where we stood sort of compared to our competitors, those that might be seeking to attract business, or even for us, a big challenge of retaining business. So economic security is obviously the first and foremost, and it touches businesses and families alike.
Let's stay in the economic sector. Looking forward to the next 2 years that the newly elected mayor will face, can you see a set of circumstances that would bring a rise in property taxes in the city?
So Wisconsin Rapids has, because of its large tax base reliant on the manufacturing sector, it isn't just paper making. There's other aspects of our property tax base that's based that receives its valuation from other sectors. The biggest challenge or threat that Wisconsin Rapids faces in that regard is, let's say the mill were to the Verso paper making operations. They are our largest taxpayer, but there's others that are not too far behind them either.
Right.
And so any one of them, let's say, were to have a devaluation gifted to them. It could be in the form of a closure, it could be in the form of the state realizing that maybe it's overvalued, overassessed.
Okay.
That could be shifted, that burden could be shifted to homeowners, to residential property taxpayers. The other threat that we've been watching, and this is again because I've been faced with it and been watching it, my counterparts in other cities in the state have seen big boxes that have challenged their assessments with the state and gotten a reduction in their assessment. Well, communities don't reduce their budgets when those occur. That base gets spread. So in the case of a manufacturing sector, for example, a large property taxpayer has a reduction in their value. Homeowners will see a larger pick up a larger share of that. And we have seen that. When NewPage fought their assessment before they were Verso, they were granted a major devaluation. Ocean Spray challenged theirs, among others. So it has been happening, and it's a threat. Obviously, if we don't replace that tax base with new tax base, and so that the rest is sort of part of the story.
Staying in the economic sector, for many years now, we're talking about close to 30 years, it's been a frequent headline in our city about diversifying and developing the businesses so that we're not reliant on any one particular industry.
Sure.
Give us the state of where that diversity is at and what any future mayor can do to make that better.
Well, you mentioned that it has been for 30 years, and I would say it's going to take all of that and then some to truly meet the definition of diversification that our community needs to have. So I would say that any mayor, and I've been faced with it only because I've held the office now for 3.5 years, is the fact that a lot of these challenges happened over time, and it's going to take that same amount of time or there to undo them. But I do think that there are ways to accelerate that diversification, and that is by way of retention of a lot of our businesses, being close to them and listening to their needs. That if they're looking to diversify their own operations, but they need capital, need financing, for example, it's trying to work with the state and other agencies, private and public alike, to help maybe meet their needs so they can diversify. Because when they're diversified, they're not as threatened or as much of at risk for competition or to be put out of business. So I think there's a big opportunity to accelerate that, and that's by my policy of staying close to our businesses and understanding and listening to their needs. But beyond that, how do we diversify? We're seeing a larger, part of our community or region, our Wisconsin Rapids area, let's say, with development south of the community, for example, which are not so much in the manufacturing sector, but maybe more tourism-based, right? With the golf course development with Sand Valley,
right.
That we're going to see a growth in the hospitality and tourism sector. And so how do we maximize that full potential so there isn't what's called leakage? And that's the same thing whether you're talking about attracting retail businesses. It all comes down to, well, what is the economic spend that could be occurring in our city but is not? And that's something that we've been paying close attention to because there's business opportunities in that leakage question.
So what issue is developing that maybe isn't garnering headlines yet? Okay, it's not on the top of the front page, but it's an issue that's becoming a pressing issue in our city, in our greater community, that is going to need your attention and the mayor's attention in the upcoming term.
That's a great question. What issue's growing? I think I mentioned some of the question about growth surrounding the city. Right. And Wisconsin, for those that are political science junkies and pay close attention to that, is very unique in the sense that we have a lot of governmental units, right? So we've got cities, counties, towns, villages, all sort of in the sphere of local government, in addition to your state and your federal government level. So a challenge that Wisconsin Rapids is going to be faced with and has been faced with, so this isn't brand new, is the question about providing services to our neighbors. And by that I mean maybe the wastewater issue. And I think beyond that, because our budgets have our growth in a lot of sort of these more rural communities across the state that don't see as much growth as some of the metro areas of Madison and Milwaukee, is the growth in our tax base. And because we don't have the growth in the tax base, when you have rising costs of doing business, wages or costs for goods and services, municipalities are going to be faced with really strong challenges with what do they do in their budgets. So let's say there would be a major devaluation in the assessment of one of our neighbors. Maybe it's the village of Buren. Again, very reliant on one large tax base. Now, of course, they're doing things to try to diversify themselves in that regard. But let's say something happened to them where their budgets would be extremely challenged. I think the region, and this is long-standing, that the region has continuously been open to partnering and sharing services between the municipalities. I don't see there's really going to be an impetus for it unless it's forced, and where municipalities are going to have to do something about it. But over the years, we've all been open to sharing services. The city shares with many of our neighbors in various regards, and that's a good thing. But I think that's going to be something on the horizon. The 2016 budget, for example, was one of the most difficult budgets to prepare in the effect that Wisconsin statutes require you to keep your expenditures low, and there's a program called the Expenditure Restraint Program. And the intent is clear, that they want you to control your costs, that local government needs to control its cost. And there's a couple of ways that they tell you how to do that. Well, Wisconsin Rapids, as we all know, has not had a lot of new construction, whether it's homes or businesses or any other development. And one of the measures in that program is your budget growth is dictated based on the amount of new construction you have. Well, if you don't have any new construction, and let's say your costs are up over here, you've offered wage, let's say you've got settlements or contracts with the two protective service unions, that over the next couple of years we're committed to wage increases, that if we don't have a certain amount of growth in our budget, we can't afford some of those commitments. So what do? You have to make room in your budget. You're going to be challenged with some of those things. So I think that's a big challenge that we're going to be faced with, is just on the realities of budgeting, and that's not new, but will continue to be a challenge, and I think it's going to be accelerated.
Okay. One thing that did get our attention recently as a community was the news that local law enforcement said Wisconsin Rapids had become a hub for heroin distribution. That took the breath away from a lot of us as we read that, Mayor. Talk about that issue and what city government can do to protect our city, to deal with this issue that's destroying lives. One of the law enforcement folks said, I can't call it an epidemic, but it might get there. Talk about that with us.
Well, I think to many people, it sort of blindsided a lot of people, and it was a stark reality check about, we're a happy and a safe community, and we're immune to those challenges that we think that are inner city, big city problems.
Yeah.
And while a lot of that is true from violent crimes and things, yes, I would agree that we thankfully don't have those problems to deal with. But we have seen a growth in the heroin and the opiate and other illegal drug activity. Okay. And that's come as a result of a number of years. I can remember first taking office in 2012 and 2013, working with the chief here, Chief Hoyer in Wisconsin Rapids, but even my counterparts, both in Stevens Point and Marshfield, talking about the issue of heroin and how it's growing in rural markets across the country, particularly those that have some economic distress or decline. Okay. Because there's a number of pressures, obviously, where people turn to different abuses and things where, if the economy was really strong, those things might be more challenged to occur in a community. So we held a heroin summit some years ago in 2012 or 2013 and had subcommittee meetings since. In fact, just this week, we had a meeting, a very comprehensive group, and sort of to your question, what can city government do?
Yes.
City government can use its convening power to call a meeting of all of these stakeholders. So at that meeting, we had members of the faith community, we had members of the education community, both K-12 and those beyond, members from Corrections, Department of Corrections, law enforcement, philanthropy, obviously elected officials, Wood County Health and Human Services, both agencies in the room, all to talk about how each of us has a role to play in dealing with the issue of heroin abuse. And it's more than heroin, it's also opiates, it's prescription drugs. Another group that was not mentioned was our local hospital. Our chief medical director was there to talk about the prescription policies in which prescription drugs, because that's always said it's often said as a gateway to heroin abuse or heroin use, and that is to have a multi-pronged, multi-pillared approach to dealing with this, that you can't arrest your way out of the problem. However, just this week, City Council did respond to the law enforcement question or law enforcement pillar and said, we need to amp up and resource up our game in the area of detective, and sort of investigation of these issues. So the city will be hiring another drug detective. So we'll have 2 detectives on staff devoted and dedicated to this issue. We also participate in the Regional Drug Task Force, which is a really strong partnership of many of the jurisdictions surrounding us. Because when the news came out about Wisconsin Rapids being a hub or characterized as a hub, the question is, are we the hub of the state? Are we the hub of the region? What are we the hub of? And many would say that we're the Central Wisconsin hub, but there are many pieces to that wheel that are just as bad or if not worse. And so now that the issue has been called out, I think we're positioning ourselves to send a strong message, because dealing with this in a comprehensive fashion with all of the stakeholders, to really send a message that this is not a place, we're not open for that type of business, and we need to have a hard line and a really important standard set, because this issue will singularly tear our neighborhoods apart. Some of the most economically challenged is where it started, and that's where we've seen the most of the activity in the use and obviously the drug busts. But it doesn't mean it's only going to happen there. This issue does cross all economic statuses. It's not just some of the more challenged or the poor. It's also some of the most affluent, which is strange, because when most people think about drug issue and drug use, we assume it's the those that are not working, those that might have more time on their hands. But it crosses all spectrums, and it's because of the gateway being painkillers oftentimes to greater use. So how the city will address it, I think we've taken some really good steps forward in addressing that issue. However, it's going to take a long road ahead for a comprehensive group to really solve the issue.
Throughout the course of our discussion tonight, you mentioned your convening power on a couple of different occasions. Talk about how you use that in terms of the city, the council, the city employees, the community, but the office of mayor, and how you have to bring people together to find solutions, whether it's the heroin issue, whether it's economic development, whatever happens in our community.
Sure. Well, it's a really good point, because when people think about powers of the mayor. Oftentimes there's question about what can the mayor do about these particular issues. That's a very valid question, one that I didn't quite know the answer to until I held the office myself. So having now held the office, it's become much more clear about where the potential lies. And I think, so we talked about heroin, we covered that issue just now. Another issue where convening powers are becoming very important is in the issue of aquatics. This issue has been challenged, the community's been challenged with the future of what it's going to do with its pool. Many communities, Nakusa and Buren, now Port Edwards, have closed their pools and removed their pools. But a very important public service of a municipality is obviously to keep people safe through public safety, but it's also to provide that recreational space for reasons for retention or recruitment of residents. They want to live in communities where these amenities exist. So one issue that's sort of lasted from administrations prior has been to regionally discuss the issue of aquatics and how Wisconsin Rapids, the largest municipality in the region, could use its sort of size with partnership of the surrounding municipalities to solve the issue of regional aquatics. Now, of course, there's obviously the details are always to be worked out, and the challenges lie in the details oftentimes. But I think that's a convening sort of opportunity. Another one that I would mention, and I alluded to it earlier, and that's the creation of the mayor's councils. And that was a vision I had prior to running for office the first time, was that residents want to be involved and engaged beyond the ballot box.
Certainly.
And one way to do that is to convene residents around issues they're passionate about. One of the early issues that I heard a lot about, and this again spanned a lot of different interest groups in the community, whether it's the realtors that are in the business of trying to recruit people or sell people homes in our market versus maybe other markets, to gardeners and some of the people that really just care about the image of our city, and that's on beautification. And one can look at just the beautification aspect and like the what's been done with the Mayor's Council on Beautification. But it's much more than that. We've now, through that council, planted a lot of pride in our community where people drive by projects, whether it's the youth entrance signs to the city where the youth themselves went out and planted and said, you know what, the entrances to our city need to be improved, because when we have an opportunity to provide someone the best impact or the best experience one has when they come to the city, those entrance signs need to be improved. So small projects like that really contribute to a much larger picture about a community is alive, it's well, and it's vibrant. And there's a lot more work to be done in that regard, but I'll tell you, there's nothing been more gratifying than seeing these residents contribute their time and contribute money oftentimes in pulling their residents and friends and neighbors together to solve issues of blight, of maybe underutilization, just to give the community a breath of fresh air. And I think the Mayor's Council on Beautification is one such example. We've also got a couple of other Mayor's Councils. The other one that I would mention is the Mayor's Council on Youth. And this group just got launched last year, and we launched both with Lincoln and high school students. We had 35 students apply to be on the Mayor's Council on Beautification, on Youth. And those youth went through a process where they threw out ideas of what they wanted their city to be. But one thing that struck me about that group and really sort of gave me a chilling feeling was it wasn't many years ago I was in their shoes, right, in the same classroom where we met, and it was a bit ironic, but listening to the youth talk about what they wanted their city to be when maybe they graduated high school, and when they wanted to come back or were graduating from college. Would this be a place where they would come back to and raise their family? And many of those kids, we often hear that kids want to, when they're 18, the first thing they want to do is leave.
Right.
And that's true, and they should if they want to pursue other educational opportunities, but get armed with experiences and the like to be able to come back and make our city a better place. But one thing about this Mayor's Council on Youth was that when we went around the room, the answers were that they wanted to be back here. That this was a place where they wanted to raise a family, because the environment that they were raised in, whether it's safety or whether it's recreational opportunities or cost of living maybe, the one challenge though obviously was job opportunities and economic, and that's ultimately what's going to resonate with these people when they get done maybe with college or other things, to come back to the community and to live and raise a family. So that was a unique accomplishment. Now we're going to be using them on the aquatics component, so they can choose and choose sort of their peers and interview them to get their feedback and input on the aquatics issue. They were involved in the beautification project, but these are very passionate kids that are going to be our next leaders, right? And what is the city doing to equip them? And really, all the power that I used was the convening power of getting them committed and assembled as a group to inform us as decision makers. There's a couple city council members on there as well as city staff who have been informed about their opinions and sort of give their their feedback and input on what the future should look like. The third Mayor's Council that we launched was on sustainability. And sustainability means a lot of things to a lot of people. It isn't just the environmental sustainability, it's also fiscal sustainability, it's also quality of life issues and the like. So that's a group that launched, and they're working through a process right now. It's called the Green Tier Legacy Program. And what that is doing is it's benchmarking the city of Rapids in a number of areas, whether it's transportation or walkability or recycling from the environmental standpoint or consumption of energy resources. How is Wisconsin Rapids doing? Are they managing their resources effectively? And really thinking about the global environment in which we live. So it isn't just environmental, there's a lot of other issues that they're concerned about. So those are a couple of examples of the convening power that the city can utilize to get people involved beyond the ballot box and also make their city a better place.
What's the best way for you, 2016, to stay in connection, in communication with your public, with the residents, so they feel that they're on top of what the mayor's office is doing on their behalf?
That was a big push that I made in my first term, and it's continued in my second term. And I'll tell you, it's not a job complete, and that's finding ways in which people get their information. Mm-hmm. In the advent of social media, there's yet a few more avenues and channels in which people get their information. So obviously, launching the city on Facebook was a big first step in communicating with thousands of residents who use Facebook or social media to get their information. And it's been very the response has been great. People learn now about snow conditions and road closures and any other public interest issue instantly, as opposed to maybe more conventional, traditional ways via the newspaper or turning on the TV. Right. Not to say that those issues are gone. In fact, we continue to use those channels just alongside the other issues. But that's been an important aspect for me to get people's input and people's feedback, is to listen to people on social media. The neat part is it also puts them very direct with their elected official. And I think that's a neat part that prior to running for mayor didn't exist in this community, where people couldn't reach out to their mayor, didn't see what their mayor was up to via things like social media. And so I try to maintain a very effective social media presence, not only to inform, but also to get what's on people's minds, to get their feedback and impressions on issue. And I'll tell you, it's made me a better mayor because I've been a better listener through the process. A lot of people like to be able to set up meetings at City Hall, and that's great. I love that. But people realize that they don't always have the time to set up a half an hour with the mayor, and they just want to type a half an hour on their computer at home at 11 o'clock at night and rant, right? And that's great because they're now afforded that opportunity. So there's multiple ways in which the city is now communicating and listening, like I say, to residents, which is equally important.
Let's look 2 years down the line. You win the election in April. You embark on another term. Mm-hmm. What do you hope and dream, because you said you were a dreamer earlier in this interview, what do you dream Wisconsin Rapids looks like in January of 2018?
Sure. Well, one of the big things that I maybe beat myself up and been frustrated with personally is when we think about, and I call it life cycle of property, right? When we think about the vacant properties around this community, they're a sign of distress because the business is no longer, in many cases, if it's vacant. So, we can pick on a few, I suppose. When people drive on the corner of 8th and East Grand, they see the former Chamois car wash, right? Mm-hmm. And some of these properties now are becoming nuisance, right? Where there's they're accumulating rubbish and materials that shouldn't be there. But it's also a sign of the past. And I think something that I thought that the mayor's office should do, and I hear from residents all the time, is the city should take a more active role in dealing with vacant and blighted and underutilized properties. And I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I would also say it's not just the city's responsibility. All of those properties are owned by somebody, and they all have an obligation as a property owner to make sure they meet code and are compliant. I get a lot of comments about 8th Street, and you see businesses that are no longer vacant properties, and I think there's a major opportunity for the city to approach infill and redevelopment of these properties. The other big thing that we've been positioning and I've been building a foundation for over the last 4 years, 3.5, 4 years, is to try to get a real concerted effort and success in redevelopment of the downtown and the waterfront district. That's a central place for so many people, not just city residents, but for our broader region. And I would measure my success 2 years from now, as I've done sort of as evidenced with the city buying properties and taking some of the risk on firsthand, is to make sure that some of those properties we have bought are now actively producing in the economy again. And that can be in many forms, right? If we're looking to try to get housing back in the downtown again, that's a major accomplishment if we're able to do that. And I'm very convinced and very confident that we can do that. The other thing is just a startup of new businesses. Every vacancy to me is an opportunity space for somebody to start an enterprise. They may be growing their enterprise, they may relocate, but every one of those vacant businesses was a contributor to the economy. If they're vacant or not utilized, they're now a detractor from the economy, the local economy. So there isn't a lot of real complex or big fancy things that we have to do to get these things done. Sometimes, though, it's pulling a group together, real estate professionals, developers alike, to say, what can we do with this piece of property? What can we do to get it producing, whether it's maybe hiring people to clean the property up, but then even beyond that, we want to get people working in these places again too, and that's how you turn an economy around, is your infill development that may have evaporated because of economic issues around the community, but that would be sort of the big dream, is that we've got a lot more occupancy to our vacancy issues today. We sit next to a mall, right? It was a regional mall that produced in the 70s and the 80s. There will have to be some conversation and action by the city at some level, like it was when it was created in the 70s under Mayor Penza, but will have to be addressed going forward. And unfortunately or fortunately, however people want to look at it, the mall ownership is kept current on their obligations. So the city isn't really in a position to take that issue head on. But informally, the conversations that I continue to have with mall ownership are, what are we doing to recruit? What are we doing to attract businesses and enterprise to the mall property? So take the mall and you look at any other vacant property around the city, that'll be sort of my big focus and will continue to be my focus in the next 2 years.
Imagine this with me for a moment.
Sure.
As I sit with you at this table, resident of Wisconsin Rapids, I represent every resident of Wisconsin Rapids. So tell me, face to face, why on February 16th I should cast a ballot for you.
Sure. Well, Milt, thanks for the question, because I think everybody's wondering, why should we keep the incumbent? Why should we keep this guy in the position, in the shoes of mayor? I think a number of reasons. We've made a lot of progress in the last 3.5 years, whether it's acquiring property, promoting redevelopment to the city, getting a lot of our city services online and accessible to businesses and becoming more business friendly in that regard, being real responsive, that when somebody has a complaint or a concern about the city, it just doesn't go unheard at City Hall, that it gets acted upon. And if we hear it enough, we act on it that much sooner because it's that much more of an issue. And I think under my leadership that's been inclusive and brought people to the table that haven't been involved in government or in making our city a better place, that people can expect that for the next 2 years, just like they have in the last 3.5 years. That I'm directly accessible to the people. I'm very pleased to be involved with a lot of the youth efforts in our community, and as somebody that grew up here and often thought, our city government isn't listening, they're not doing the things that they need to be doing to make sure that I come back here someday and this is a place where I want to buy a home and raise a family and ultimately find work. I think a big reason why people should cast their vote again, maybe a third time for me. If they didn't the first 2 times, maybe they did for the third time, is to make sure that our city stays on a path to prosperity. Our city has a lot of challenges, and I'm not going to pretend that we don't. But they need a leader that will take them head on and will work to address them to make sure Wisconsin Rapids realizes its full potential.
Thank you for the conversation today,
Sure.
Mayor.
Thank you.
That has been this edition of Get to Know Your City, as we visit with all three of the mayoral candidates for this 2016 election cycle. Be sure to watch River City's Community Access for all 3 of those conversations as you prepare to vote in the primary on February 16th. Join us again right here on River City's Community Access Media.